Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim, Chapter 4, Halacha 1. This is part 3 of the Shir, final part in the series, and 37b1 in the Art Scroll. So, before we were talking about the perimeter wall, that's going to be a wall, and Bet Hillel is saying that if you're going to try to plant foreign species between your vineyard and your wall, you can do it, but you need to have 4 amma separation between the vineyard and the patch that you're going to be planting in. The planting patch has to at least be 4 amos wide. Why 4 amos wide? It has to be considered significant. And if you're doing something that's going to be less than that patch, then it's not going to be viewed as significant. And then because it's not significant, it's going to be viewed as an intermingled vineyard. And then you need to have between the wall and this new patch 4 amos. So Bet Hillel is actually not going to be applying a penalty to this. Bet Shammai is. They're going to be saying that you need to have it to be a bigger space that is going to be more significant for this planting area. In other words, you can't just go with 4 amos. You got to be up at 8 amos to try to plant within it. It needs to really be seen as significant. And we covered this before in chapter 1, 2, and 3, that, if you're not doing something in a way that looks like a significant planted area in the middle of another field, it's going to look like you just sort of planted everything together, and it's a problem. So that's the basic summation, and we left off part 2 in the shir talking about, well, when you're going to put a perimeter wall of a vineyard, does it have to fully enclose the vineyard? Does it have to go all the way around on all 4 sides? The answer was no, it doesn't. It can do just one side. Now, the Gemara in part 3 of the shir is going to say, but what if this wall is not going to fully cover the vineyard? What then? So in other words, let's say you have half a wall. What's going to be the law like that? So the Gemara asks a question. It says, is the space enclosed by a wall on one side of the vineyard not deemed to be a vineyard perimeter until the entire side is bordered by a wall? In other words, if it's going to be less than the size of the vineyard on one side, well, maybe it doesn't get the qualification of a wall at all. Maybe it's just there. And maybe only actually having it fully covered is going to be. And the idea is that maybe the area between the wall and the vines can't be regarded as fenced in within that vineyard. And maybe it has to be where that wall has to go along the entire side in order to get this vineyard perimeter stringency and also leniency that can come as well. So the Gemara is going to now address this, and it's going to say, let us resolve it from the following discussion. Because Rabbi Zera said in the name of Rabbi Yasu, said in the name of Rav Masna, there is no tail for a large vineyard, and there is no vineyard perimeter for a small vineyard. Again, we're trying to define what is a vineyard. This is all a conversation in chapter 4, halacha 1, to get you to do this roundabout approach where you're going through and getting all of these characteristics. And when you put all of the characteristics together, you get a picture of what is a vineyard. Now, in halacha 4, chapter 4, halacha 4 coming up, a basic vineyard is going to be 5 vines, and it's going to be according to Bet Hillel, where it's going to have 3 vines and 2 vines. And that extra third vine that's there is going to count as a tail. It's called a tail. And according to most commentators, it means that the vines are planted in 2 rows, and the idea is going to be like this third vine protrudes like a tail. Okay, so if you have 2 vines facing 2 vines, and one is like a tail, the tail is considered to be an integral part of the vineyard. You need that 5th vine. And so in order to plant near that tail, you still have to be 4 amos away from you have to have a 4 amma gap from the tail and whatever foreign seed that you're doing. You can't treat the tail or an area opposite the tail like as if it's just one vine sitting by itself. And Rav Masna is asserting here that these stringencies only apply in the case of a small vineyard, where you're going to have 2 rows. And in the case of a large vineyard, which contains 3 or more rows, if you have this extra vine, it's not counted as part of the vineyard. Rather, it has the same law as an individual vine situated outside the vineyard. And if you were going to try to plant opposite this one leftover vine, it would require a distancing of only 6 tefachim. And you can't say that, oh, this is part of the vineyard. So what this is all doing is it's teaching, says Arash Cirilio, that if a small vineyard, which is going to be 2 rows of 3, is going to be bordered by a wall, the space between the vineyard and the wall does not have the law of a vineyard perimeter, and therefore it may be planted with foreign seed even if it is less than 12 amos wide. That's a big chiddush. So Rav Masna is going to elaborate on this, and again, this is a backdoor way to get you to understand what is halachically going to be a vineyard and what's not. And what do we do about separations? And what do we do with this tail? What can you plant next to this tail? Is this tail, this extra vine, going to count as a standalone vine? Rav Masna elaborates. He says there is no tail for a large vineyard because you do not need a tail to make it into a vineyard. In other words, let's say you have 3 rows of 3. Well, you know, the tail isn't there to make it into a vineyard. If you have a row of 3 and 2, you need that extra vine there, that tail, to make it count as a vineyard, because a vineyard of 4 vines is not a vineyard. But if you have 3 rows of 3, you don't need a tail. So if you planted a 10th vine and it's sort of just sticking out, Rav Masna is pointing out that that vine is not essential to turning it into a vineyard, because you already have a vineyard. You can say it's the first 3 rows, or you could say it's the second 3 rows, or you could say it's the last of the 3 rows. And you don't need this tail that's there as a 10th vine. You just say that this is just a standalone vine outside of the vineyard. It's already been made a vineyard. And the Gemara is saying that there is no vineyard perimeter for a small vineyard. Why? Because applying that stringency to a small vineyard would compel us to render prohibited an area on the outside further than the area of the inside. And that would result in the following paradox. The Gemara says about this paradox like this: inside the vineyard, that is between the vines, it is prohibited to introduce foreign seed only within a gap measuring less than 8 amos. So we learned in the Mishnah before that if somebody plants 2 rows of vines, these rows are going to combine to form a vineyard, which is going to be subject to the 4 amma work area. But now what about if the distance between the 2 rows are going to be equal or exceed the 8 amos? Then the vines are going to be considered to be independent entities, and foreign seed does not need to be distanced any more than 6 tefachim, because basically what this is trying to say is if the vineyard doesn't have enough density, right? You didn't plant all these vines together. Well, then you could say it's not really a vineyard. Yeah, there's vines there, but it has to at least be within a certain distance of one another to qualify. And if you have some vines over here and some vines over there, and they're really far apart, you can't put them together and say it's a vineyard and then get all of the stringencies about planting near it. In other words, you just say these are standalone vines and these are some standalone vines. And, 3 standalone vines and 3 standalone vines is not going to combine to make 6 vines, which would be a vineyard. Basically, you would say this is 3 vines, and you could plant within 6 tefachim of these 3 vines, and you could plant foreign seed within 6 tefachim of those 3 vines, and it doesn't combine. But if it is close enough to combine, then what will happen is it will form a vineyard, and you have to do these setbacks. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say inside the vineyard, that is between the vines, it is prohibited to introduce foreign seed only within a gap measuring less than 8 amos. But outside the vineyard, between the vineyard and the wall, the prohibition would apply to gaps up to 12 amos. So it would seem to be illogical that the space outside the vineyard would be more stringent than the space between the vines themselves. And we're concluding that the law of the vineyard perimeter was never stated regarding small vineyards. So these, by the way, are going to be halachic vineyards. They're still going to be like, say, 3 and 3. And Pnei Moshe says that should a small vineyard be bordered by a wall, one would be allowed to introduce foreign seed in the space between the vineyard and the wall after you distance 4 amos from the vineyard, and even if the entire space is only slightly more than 4 amos. So the Gemara is going to continue on the vineyard perimeter wall, and the Gemara asks a question. It says, what is considered a small vineyard in this respect? In other words, what is going to be with the law of the vineyard perimeter, the wall? And the Gemara says, one that consists of a row of 3 vines facing another row of 3 vines. So if you have 2 rows containing 3 vines each, then the vineyard consists of only 2 rows. And if you have an 8 amma gap, that would be enough to allow foreign planting between them. And it therefore cannot be subject to the 12 amma vineyard perimeter stringency. So in actuality, the small vineyard is going to apply to any vineyard that consists of only 2 rows, even if the rows contain more than 3 vines, because ultimately the rows would not combine to form a vineyard if they are 8 amos apart. So Rav Masna's example of 3 vine rows is connected to the fact that a vineyard containing 3 rows of 3 vines is each going to constitute a large vineyard. That's going to be subject to the vineyard perimeter. So to convey this, Rav Masna is describing the small vineyard as containing 2 rows of 3 vines each, and that implies that a vineyard containing 3 rows is going to be classified as a large vineyard. And the Gemara continues. And again, part of the point is that, look, if this is too spread apart for row A and row B, and row A has 3 vines and row B has 3 vines, and it's too far apart, you can plant between these 2 vineyards because it's not a vineyard and that's not a vineyard, and this is just a collection of vines and that's a collection of vines, and you're not planting between a vineyard. So what this is trying to show is that you have to have a certain density with the vines to start to qualify. And what is a large vineyard? The Gemara is going to define it. It's going to say this indicates that if a vineyard consists of a row of 3 vines facing another row of 3 vines facing another row of 3 vines, it does have a vineyard perimeter. And that's going to make it classified as a large vineyard. So, in other words, you have to have 9 vines to be considered to be a large vineyard. And the Mishnah is teaching that another point, that if you planted the 3 rows containing 3 vines each, the rows combine to form a single vineyard as long as they are within 16 amos of each other. And in these cases, one may not introduce foreign seed between these rows unless they are at least 16 amos between them. And so when you're dealing with the large vineyard, there's no logical impediment to prohibiting the introduction of foreign seed within the perimeter that's up to 12 amos wide. So what this is saying is, it's saying, look, go back and look at the Mishnah. Look at the distancing. And if you have, this distancing that we're talking about of being like, 8 amos wide, you have 4 amos spacing, you have 4 amos planting strip, and 12 amos, right? You have a 4 amma blank strip, that's a walking strip or a work strip, a blank area, and you have a 4 amma planting area and another 4 amma area. Well, you can start to look at this and start saying, well, there's similarities here between, spacing between, if I have a collection of vines over here and a collection of vines over here, if I can start planting between these. Because again, it doesn't have the qualification of a vineyard. And what is going to be a qualification of vineyard? Well, the vines have to be pretty close together. And, you can't go look at the distancing of the Mishnah to start saying like, let me put this spacing between, this row of vines and that row of vines and still call it a vineyard. It's not a vineyard. And so the Gemara is gonna conclude with a statement that resolves all of these questions. And Rabbi Zera said, this ruling of Rav Masna tells us that if one erected a row of boards facing only 3 vines while the other 3 vines on the same side were left exposed, it has a vineyard perimeter. So what this is saying is that you put up a series of boards, and the boards are large enough to close up part of the vineyard. And so what this is saying is that you can easily distinguish between a 3-row vineyard that's bordered entirely by one side with a partition and a 9-row vineyard that has only 3 rows bordered by a partition. So it's going to be the very subject of the original question in this Gemara. Rabbi Zera is saying that there's really no difference between these cases, and the Gemara is resolving the question not on Rav Masna's ruling, but what Rabbi Zera was saying, that a partially enclosed side of a vineyard is subject to the law of the vineyard perimeter. So what this is trying to say is that if you have a partial wall there, and it's going to have the halachic status of a vineyard, and this partial wall doesn't fully enclose one side of the vineyard, well, the part that has the wall is going to be subject to the laws of the vineyard perimeter. And so you might have thought that the whole thing needs to be closed off, but Rabbi Zera's point is it does not. Now, the Gemara is going to cite a ruling pertaining to the law of the vineyard perimeter, and this is going to get back into what we were talking about before, and I will tell you what that is. What we were talking about before is, really chapter 4, halacha 1, you can read it like this, that, this is dealing with a vineyard and then something changed on it, right? What happened in the first part? Well, there's a blank patch in the middle, maybe by a fire. And you didn't plant it that way. You planted it as a vineyard, but a fire happened. You emptied out the vines. Now you're going to plant something else there. Bet Shammai is going to be putting in a penalty because he doesn't want you doing stuff like that. Bet Hillel does not. And so really what this is talking about is the difference between planting something from the start one way and building it, one way, or doing it, after the fact. You've already started planting it, you planted it, and now you're going to make changes to it. And we're getting to that with the wall. Rabbi Yudin asks a question and says, if one erects a wall within a wall surrounding the vineyard, so that the second wall stands within a space that had previously been rendered a vineyard perimeter by the first wall, what is the status of the area between the walls? The question goes like this. Let's say you have a vineyard and you have a vineyard perimeter. It's a halachic vineyard perimeter. And everything that we've been talking about with the halachic vineyard perimeter, like what Bet Hillel says, where you need a distance between the vineyard and the wall of 12 amos in order to start doing the seed, and the spacing will be, 4 amma blank area, 4 amma planting strip, and a 4 amma blank area between the planting strip and the wall. And it's already been built. This wall is there. It's been established as a perimeter wall. It's done. And the vines are done. He's asking like this. He says, now you go and you build a new wall. After this has already been built. After this wall has the halachic status of being a vineyard perimeter, and thus with the spacing. And now you build a wall on the inside between the vineyard and this old wall. You build a new wall there. Now there's 2 walls. So they're saying, well, what about the planting between this gap now? What's going to be? Is the new wall going to get the new designation of a vineyard perimeter? Is the old one going to get the designation of vineyard perimeter? Is it going to be where you can still do the planting, and you have to do the same setbacks like we were talking about before because the first wall already has the vineyard perimeter status? Or can you say it's a fence, and on the other side of the fence I can plant as close as I want. I don't need to worry about it. So that's going to be the question. So if I built this second wall right up next to the vineyard perimeter, and right up next to the vineyard, and now I'm going to say, look, I have a new wall there. It's a wall. And on the other side of the wall, opposite the vineyard, the other side of the vineyard, I'm going to plant barley seeds there. And by the way, it might only be 1 amma difference between this vineyard and this very thin fence. That's the second new fence. And now this new planting, is that going to be allowed? And because you'd say, oh, I have a new wall. I can do what I want, right? Or you're going to say, no, vineyard perimeter's back there, and the same spacing that you had is going to qualify because it was already planted this way. It was already done. It already had the designation. That's what the Gemara is questioning. And again, this is helping us to understand what is a vineyard. Rabbi Yudan proceeds to answer his own question, and he says, if there are at least 3 tefachim between the walls, it is permitted to introduce foreign seed there, but if there are not 3 tefachim between the walls, it is forbidden to introduce foreign seed there. So why 3 tefachim? Well, lavud, right? We already covered this. If you have a patch, covered this in part 2 this year. If you have a blank spot in a wall, and you have the wall, the fence, maybe it's a wood fence, and it has one of the wood parts is missing. As long as it's less than 3 tefachim, lavud takes over. That's a halacha Moshe Sinai, and it counts as sealed. And what he's saying is, look, if you built a fence, and fence number 2 is the new fence, and it's going to be a distance between fence 1 and fence 2 of only 3 tefachim, he's saying it counts as a sealed thing. And so between this, you can plant whatever you want. But if you're going to be putting this new fence more than 3 tefachim, there's no lavud. And this border now, this new fence between the vineyard and the old fence does not get the status of the vineyard of the perimeter. And he's saying it already, the old fence already has the status of the vineyard of the perimeter. And that means that the planting areas that we were talking about with 12 amos still apply. So you can't plant anything on the other side of a fence. Now you would have thought, but I built a fence and I can put whatever I want. And they're saying no. In the cases of the vineyards, once it's already been planted and established, you have a hard time changing things. And that is part of why Bet Shammai is trying to put a penalty in there to say and to discourage this kind of behavior. He wants it to be where you planted a vineyard and you did it this way, it's a vineyard. Don't start putting new things in there. And if he is, you're going to make big issues with setbacks as penalty to dissuade that kind of behavior. But over here, Rabbi Yudan's pointing out another point. Maybe there's no penalty, but what he's saying is it's already been established. You've already built it this way. Now, the Gemara is going to give another ruling concerning the vineyard perimeter. And Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi says in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, if at any point between the vineyard and the wall there was a space of 12 amos, the stringent law of the perimeter is going to be removed from the entire enclosed area of the wall, including any portion that's less than 12 amos wide. So what Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is saying is, look, if you have a vineyard and you have a wall, and at any point of this wall there's 12 amos there, you have all the laws of the vineyard perimeter in regards to planting and everything else and separations and setbacks. And you only need one part of it to count as 12 amos. So if this wall, sort of is angled off and other parts of the wall, the separation between the vineyard and the wall, is going to be less than 12 amos. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is saying as long as part of this space is going to be 12 amos, it's going to count. Rabbi Hiskia says that this is only if the space is 12 amos by 12 amos long. In other words, you have to draw a box, and the width of the box has to be 12 amos, and the length of the box have to be 12 amos. And if it slants and then goes down to less, as long as you have a part that's at least 12 by 12, distancing the wall and the vineyard, you're okay. And Rabbi Mana is going to say differently. Now, keep in mind, Rabbi Hiskia started the academy in Sipori in the north, and he gave it over to his successor, Rabbi Mana. And a lot of times, Rabbi Hiskia and Rabbi Mana's arguments will basically come down to the same sorts of arguments like Shmuel and Rav, a lot of the logical points like that. So Rabbi Mana says that the stringent law of the perimeter is removed even if the gap between the vineyard and the wall measures 12 amos at one end alone and proceeds to narrow from that point. So in other words, he's going to be saying that as long as one point is going to be 12 amos, that's enough. And if you hit it at 12 amos and then it gets less than that, then, clearly Rabbi Mana disagrees with Rabbi Hiskia, and he's going to define this 12 amos space that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is mentioning as just being in one point. And as long as you hit it at one point, that's enough. You don't need to create a square in order to do it. So Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, whether you're going to go by Rabbi Hiskia or Rabbi Mana, is teaching that the Mishnah stated that the vineyard perimeter must be at least 12 amos wide in order for the planting of foreign seed to be perimeter there. And it does not mean that the perimeter has to be 12 amos wide across the entire length. Just any part of the perimeter measuring 12 amos is going to be enough to prevent the vineyard perimeter stringency from taking over and to forbid planting foreign seed there. So, even if the section of the perimeter is going to be, in the space where between the vineyard and the wall is going to measure less than that, you can plant foreign seed there. But again, it's as long as one part of it is going to be 12 amos, or maybe a square box is going to be 12 amos. So really, there's a lot going on here that's trying to come and do a backdoor way to try to explain what is a vineyard. And so far we know, okay, it's got 5 vines. You could put it up onto a trellis. We know that there are setback issues, and if you have a tail, and the tail is not an essential part to making the vineyard, that's going to count as a standalone vine. And we've learned what's the distancing between standalone vine or something smaller than a vineyard, let's say 3 vines by themselves, and a regular vineyard. We see there's distancing issues, and that it gets to be more strict once you have a halachic vineyard. And also this theme of, hey, once you've planted a vineyard, it seems to be very difficult to start making changes to it. We can see that that Bet Shammai is saying that there should be penalties, but we also see in what Rabbi Yudon is talking about with a wall within a wall that, it's difficult to start making changes to vineyards, and certainly planting foreign seed there is a problem. Now, why are we worried about planting foreign seed there? Well, you can't bring the omer if you have Kilayim with a vineyard. That omer for the barley wouldn't count. You're not allowed to bring it. Also, the wine that you're bringing from a vineyard that has Kilayim problems or problems with setbacks and things like that, you can't bring it to the temple. So you can't do the service with it. All right, so this is important stuff to know. And again, this is not going through and laying out in a way that we're used to for what is a vineyard, but what it's doing is saying, well, this is not a vineyard, and it has to have these characteristics, and it's got to have these setbacks. And when you put all of this together, you start getting a picture of what is a vineyard. Have a great day.